Hey everyone! So we've covered the Spectre in the Silver and Golden Ages of comic books, and now it's time to move into the Bronze Age, as this character barrels towards his role in the game-changing DC moment of history known as the Crisis of Infinite Earths. Before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island for more videos about comic book characters and much more. Following the near collision of Earths 1 and 2, the Spectre's spirit was left nearly destroyed. Long cast out by the Earth 2 version of Jim Corrigan as a result of his punishment by the Presence, the spirit was left confused. It found itself on Earth 1, where it bonded with that world's version of Jim Corrigan. As a result of this experience, the Spectre and Corrigan were for a time convinced they were both native to Earth 1, although years later the truth was eventually discovered by the Spectre. Before that time, the Spectre resumed his crime-fighting ways, but now on a different, new world that up until then had only scant encounters with the spirit. This proved particularly troubling to the criminals who would cross this being's path, as though he may not have remembered his experiences on Earth 2 at first. The growing aggression of the spirit that took place on his final days on that world were still very much present in his new role on Earth 1. In fact, if anything, he had become more violent and deadly than ever before, with a new flair for gruesomeness. One thief was melted into a pile of goo, while another criminal holding a woman hostage at gunpoint had his flesh stripped away in an instant. The spirit of vengeance, who would only appear before the criminals he killed, likely in an effort to avoid Corrigan having to deal with the Spectre being a public menace this time around, inadvertently caused people to witness deaths with no apparent cause other than a ghost only the criminals could see, leading to many terrified bystanders. One person who took it all in stride, though, was Jim Corrigan, who worked much better with this more malevolent version of the Spectre than his Earth 2 counterpart ever did. Like on Earth 2, the Earth 1 Jim Corrigan was also a police detective, but this version worked in New York City for the NYPD. This version of Jim was far more accepting of a violent and deadly Spectre, and was happy to cover up and support the ghostly being's wrath, even deploying remarkably glib humor to keep the suspicions of his superiors at the NYPD at a bare minimum. Like his counterpart, he pushed away from romance, readily accepting the goals of the Spectre and focusing on their shared desire for vengeance against criminals more than anything else. Compounding these beliefs were the fact that just as on Earth 2, the Jim Corrigan of Earth 1 was also killed by criminals and only resurrected after the arrival of the Spectre. In spite of Jim's attempts to keep romance out of his life, a wealthy woman named Gwen Sterling did eventually learn about Corrigan's situation after her father's death. Though the two clearly had mutual feelings for one another, Jim consistently kept her at a distance, knowing full well life with the Spectre would inevitably prove dangerous to a civilian. Sure enough, even with Corrigan's efforts to keep Gwen away, she was kidnapped and brainwashed on 2 separate occasions by 2 different villains. Both times the Spectre was able to save Gwen and brutally kill the kidnappers, but the danger of being around her was made clear. Yet Gwen was undeterred. When she was later taken hostage by a group of crooks, and yet again the Spectre rescued her, Gwen insisted that Corrigan marry him, in spite of the constant danger and Jim effectively being a corpse of some kind. After all, the Earth 1 version of Corrigan was never revived like he was on Earth 2, and thus, at this time, didn't even need to eat, breathe, or sleep. Jim's behavior at the time reflects someone who didn't even really view himself as truly human anymore. So he gently turned down her proposal and they departed, seemingly for the final time. But this event seemed to change Jim's view of the Spectre and left him resentful of his fate for the first time. He called out to the Presence, pleading for the chance to marry Gwen and be freed from the Spectre's mission. Unknown to Corrigan, the Presence assented to this request and returned him to life. The next day, he felt strange but thought nothing of it until the man was shot on the job. As a result, another officer was killed, and Jim was rushed to the hospital, barely surviving himself. Nevertheless, he was delighted to find himself free from the Spectre, mortal once more. Within days, Jim was engaged to Gwen. However, hearing of this news, notorious criminal Ducky McLaren arranged a trap to kill Corrigan in retaliation for him arresting one of his gang. Corrigan was brutally gunned down even after he tried to use one of the gang members as a human shield, with the rest of the gang coldly mowing both men down in response to their companion being taken hostage. They took Corrigan's corpse and left it crudely propped up against Gwen's door for her to discover. After his funeral, Jim was brought before the presence, which stated he was destined to remain on Earth, bound to the Spectre, implying this would always happen to Corrigan in any life, no matter how many times he was revived, perhaps on any world. Though Corrigan wanted eternal rest instead, his desires were ignored by the presence, and on Earth, the Spectre rose once more. He immediately slaughtered Ducky and his gang, then briefly appeared before Gwen, warning her that while the world would believe that Jim Corrigan was mistakenly thought dead and buried alive, he assured her this was not the truth, and that he was dead once more. They would not be able to get married after all. Around this time, Jim Corrigan also had an encounter with mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent. They worked together to battle two criminals called the Grandettis, though during this adventure, Kent was disgusted at the Spectre's violent behavior. The reporter was unaware that Corrigan was really the Spectre all along, and the police detective managed to keep it that way, even against the observant Clark Kent. The two successfully worked together to defeat the crooks, though the man secretly known as Superman was unable to stop the Spectre from killing them both. The experience left the reporter shaken, as the Spectre was too fast and powerful for him to even appear as Superman and confront the being. Jim Corrigan next came in conflict with a journalist named Earl Crawford. While most of the public remained oblivious to the Spectre, Crawford became convinced of the spirit's existence. He started a crusade to prove to the world that the Spectre was real, which ultimately just led him to an insane asylum. Both Corrigan and Gwen Sterling felt terrible about this, knowing full well that Earl was telling the truth. Earl eventually escaped thanks to Gwen, who, wearing a disguise, gave the man a knife so he could pry a window open and flee the asylum. Eventually, Earl did discover it was Gwen who helped him and became suspicious of her having some sort of connection to the Spectre. But ultimately nothing came of it. Earl's investigation went cold, and fearing for his safety, he abandoned any thoughts of looking into the Spectre again in the future. Perhaps sensing the situation was getting out of control and kept hurting people like Gwen and Earl, Jim Corrigan and the Spectre cut ties with Gwen for good, never contacting her again. He remained on staff at the NYPD, by then having earned the reputation as New York's toughest cop. Sometime later, Corrigan visited Gotham City, hot on the trail of a salesman who seemingly was on a spree of strangling people without any apparent pattern. There, the Spectre was reunited with Batman, an old friend of the spirit and someone even this version of Jim Corrigan had come to know and trust. Corrigan and the Spectre had come to suspect that Weaver was somehow involved with the former cult of assassins from India known as the Thugs, and they were intent on bringing him to justice. These people thought to kill through strangulation, but were supposedly wiped out in the 1830s by the British Army. As the Spectre, Corrigan was able to track down Weaver, who he found stealing a pickaxe from a graveyard. The powerful ghostly being was easily able to subdue Weaver, but in his rage, he destroyed the pickaxe. This confirmed to Corrigan that the cult was involved, since a pickaxe was used in one of their rituals. However, when he took the criminal into GCPD custody, Corrigan was unable to produce further evidence since the pickaxe was destroyed, and the Gotham police were forced to let Weaver go, outraging Police Commissioner James Gordon at the apparent incompetence of Jim Corrigan. Though Batman was initially skeptical of the cult's involvement, he became convinced that Corrigan was onto something, and began tailing Weaver, only for the detective to get ambushed by the criminal and shot at 3 times at point-blank range. Luckily, the Spectre arrived just in time, using his magic to turn the bullets into butterflies and Weaver's gun into a spider, horrifying the criminal in the process. Yet Weaver refused to reveal more under interrogation, and further investigation began turning up bizarre evidence that implicated a Gotham police detective in one of the strangulations. Teaming up, the Spectre and Batman eventually deduced that Weaver and this detective were involved in a group called the Dirty Dozers, soldiers stationed in the China-Burma-India theater during World War II. So the Spectre used his powers to peer back into the past, where he witnessed these soldiers become possessed after they destroyed the burial site of the original thugs. None of them were aware of the possession, which sat dormant for around 24 years until it took control of them back in America. Batman and the Spectre were able to end this and free the soldiers by destroying a statue of the Indian god Kali, which empowered the assassins. When informed of what happened, the soldiers were devastated at their own actions, having been completely unaware of these crimes even once the possession took hold. They turned themselves in willingly, and Batman took comfort in the fact that the courts were willing to acknowledge the unusual circumstances of these crimes, showing leniency towards these honorable men. With that, the Spectre was firmly re-established as a superhero, but now on Earth 1. We'll see how that changes and affects things, because this spirit was now a very different being, willing to kill at the blink of an eye, and pretty much regardless of whether or not the other superheroes were okay with it, was irrelevant to a being that powerful. So stay tuned here on Comic Island as we go further into the history of the Spectre, along with a lesser known DC character called Dr. 13.